the video and go through the brain anatomy virtual dissection. So you can have this up while you're going through your slides. You'll be inputting the same things on your slides that I'm doing here. All right, so that's slide 1 is the title. Slide 2, you're to slide the hand, right? Take the hand, grab it with your mouse, and choose one of your, whichever one of these brains, you would dissect if we were in class. So it's not doing anything. Don't worry about like, what is it supposed to do? Just put the hand, near the brain that you would choose. Okay, that's what we would do in class. You'd choose a brain, wash it off, put it in a pan, take it to your desk. All right, that's all you do there. And then the brain may come different ways. So some companies will send the brain, like you see in the top picture, which is shipped with the eye attached and the eye stalk, and the dura mater, which is, if you can see the shiny membrane that's covering the brain, that's the dura mater. All right, so you're going to use the green arrow, which you'll find at the bottom, and move it to where we would start cutting the dura mater if we were in class. All right, we would generally start cutting it somewhere around the top because it's looser there than it is on the bottom. And then you take the blue arrow and put it by the eye. So this is the eye, and then the eye stalk. This is attaching it to the brain. So once you remove the dura mater, it would look like this. Right? And that's what the sheep brain would look like if you were holding it in your hand in class. So now we can see the external structures of the brain. So the most anterior part is the cerebrum, and that's the largest part you see here. It's divided into a right and left hemisphere, and this is separated by a longitudinal fissure. Okay, so you're going to move the various labels that you'll find at the bottom here. You need to move them to match where the arrows are pointing, right? So this one is the longitudinal fissure. And then behind, like posterior to the cerebrum, is the cerebellum. Okay, so there's like 3 main lobes, the 2 hemispheres of the cerebrum, and then the cerebellum, right? So you put the cerebellum label with this arrow, cerebrum with this arrow. What separates the cerebellum and the cerebrum is the transverse fissure, right? So that's fissure is like a crack in a system. So you can see these are the valleys that separate the 2 parts of the brain. And then posterior to the cerebellum is the brainstem. So you'd put this label there. All right, so let's focus on the cerebrum first. You notice that there's wrinkles in the brain, and those are called gyri. The valleys between the wrinkles that are kind of dark here are the sulci, or singular is sulcus. Just like the human brain, the cerebrum of the sheep is divided into regions called lobes. All right, so the most anterior, closest to the front of the brain, is the frontal lobe. All right, so you can take these labels that you'll find at the bottom, right, and move them to these areas. At the opposite end, right, the most posterior end is the occipital lobe. In between, the central area is the parietal lobe, and below that, on the side, is the temporal lobe. All right, looking at the brain from the bottom, we see a couple of the nerves. So this is pretty interesting. The 2 pink pins are in the olfactory nerves. So I made a copy of the label for olfactory nerve and put one on each of the pink pins. All right, so these looks like vessels, but these are nerves, right, coming out of the brain. The yellow pin is pinned into something that looks like an X, right? That's the optic chiasma. That's where the optic nerves come from the eyes and cross over to go into the brain. right? So that's the optic chiasma. All right, so again, here's the optic chiasma. So we're looking at it from a different view here, right? So it's over here. But behind that is an area called the infundibulum, right? So you put your label there. And then behind that is this little raised area called the mammillary body, right? So those two arrows on the top, infundibulum and mammillary body. And then continuing, going towards the posterior end of the brain, is the midbrain, and then the pons, the medulla oblongata, and then the spinal cord. So again, you're picking up these labels that are at the bottom of the image and dragging them to where the arrow points. All right, so now we're looking from the back of the brain, the posterior region. This is the occipital lobe, right? So this person's hands are holding the frontal lobe right here. And then this hand here is holding onto the cerebellum and pulling the cerebellum apart from the cerebrum. So we're looking at this area that's in that transverse fissure. What's underneath there? So we see something that kind of looks like a butt. All right, that's this area here. That's the superior colliculus. And then, like the little butt here, is the inferior colliculus. Right, these are part of the brain that help the animal process sensory input and orienting the animal, especially with their eye movements, right, to where they need to be looking, right? Where's the predator? Where's food, right? That's where it's processing it. And then just above that, in the middle is the pineal gland, which is responsible for regulating circadian rhythms. All right, now if we were in class and we had a whole brain, we would want to cut open to see what's on the inside. So far we've just been looking at the exterior structures, except when we pull back the cerebellum, some of the exterior structures underneath there. But there's actually structures inside here. So we would take a scalpel and cut through the brain. It's really easy to cut. And we would cut through this longitudinal fissure. Okay, so what you're supposed to do is write which fissure would you cut through, and your answer goes here. It's longitudinal, right? Longitudinal. If you don't know how to spell it, it's right up here, okay? So that's what you do to complete that. When you do make that cut, now you can open the brain like you open a book, all right? And here you've got the two hemispheres, the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere of the brain. And it reveals a whole series of structures inside. Right, so some of these are labeled here. The cerebellum is, this whole structure here, but if you notice, it looks like a tree. So this has been named the tree of life. So this green arrow points to the tree of life, arbor vitae, right? Then you could also see the brain stem, which is here, right? So you're going to move that label to use this arrow to point there, and then you can see the spinal cord coming from here. Of course, it's been cut. We don't have the whole spinal cord, but you can see it start to come out of the brainstem there. All right, some other structures that are very interesting. The blue pin is the corpus callosum, and this is connecting the two hemispheres of the brain. And what's interesting about this is the tissue that gets damaged in a person who has multiple concussion injuries to their brain. For instance, the NFL players who have experienced CTE or chronic traumatic encephalopathy, they would actually see damage in this area, right? And that's the cause of their, manifesting symptoms is the damage to the corpus callosum. At least that's what they're thinking right now. It's probably a lot deeper than that and a lot more going on. There is a lot more going on. And if we were in school, we'd probably study that a lot deeper. We usually do every year. But yeah, so that's interesting to see that that's a physical structure, that has an impact on a person's personality and decision making, everything else. All right, the yellow pin is in the lateral ventricle, right, which is the space here, and this is where cerebral spinal fluid is stored. The round structure here, so this little circle of tissue, is the thalamus, right? That relays sensory and motor signals, kind of like the union station of our signals, going back and forth. And then below that, remember hypo means below. Below the thalamus is the hypothalamus, all right, which plays a role in energy maintenance, temperature regulation, and appetite. All right, and that connects directly to the pituitary gland, but we don't see that here. Hold on, let me get this machine on. All right, next slide. So the pineal gland is visible in this picture here. So right where the probe is, you can see the pineal gland right here. And then just behind that, right, posterior to that, are the two colliculi, the superior colliculus and the inferior colliculus. And this also shows the third ventricle, which is another space, right above the thalamus. And then some tissue that's stretching right above that is the fornix. So you move the labels to indicate those. All right, so looking at the brainstem a little more closely, we can actually see the pituitary gland here, this little white gland. All right, so the blue arrow points there to the pituitary gland, and then going towards the posterior end, we have the midbrain, and then the pons, the medulla oblongata, and the spinal cord. All right, so make sure you're moving the labels to indicate that. All right, and then what you're going to do in the next couple of slides is show what you know. So you're going to use the arrow tool, and I did 2 already, right, to identify at least 6 structures. So you would go to Insert, and then choose Shape, choose one of the arrow shapes, and then if you double click on it, you can type a word in there and use that to label any 6 structures. So I did 2 of the easy ones. You guys can pick some other ones, right? The corpus callosum, or look, I think I see the pituitary gland right here. You could do that, right? Parts of the brainstem. You could do the lobes, right? There's a whole bunch of structures. There's 20 structures. Choose 6 and label them there. Okay, and then what you're going to do is on the next slide, it's matching. So you've got the terms that are listed on the left and descriptions on the right, and see what matches. So the arbor vitae, arbor means tree, right? So that's that tree of life thing, right? So that's the tree of life within the cerebellum. Put the letter L right there. And then on the last slide, you're just click and drag the labels into the spaces, right? Some of them are done for you, and then you're going to do the rest. All right, so that's what you need to do to complete the slide presentation. Anything, any labels that need to be dragged to arrows, do that. Any boxes that are empty and have a question above it, enter in an answer there. Label this graph or this diagram. Label the image of the brain with 6 structures, and then do also the matching on the last 3 slides. All right, if you have questions, let me know. Email me, ask me in class. Thank you very much.